Okay. Hello, 11th and 12th grade. We are going to continue chapters 24 through 25. Today we're talking about World War I and what it's going to take for the United States to actually get into the war. Because of the Zimmerman Note and the Lusitania and many other acts of savagery on the open seas, the United States is eventually going to get into World War I, even though it's something that the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, had taken such pride in the fact that he had kept us out of the war for the first 3 years of the war. Now that he's been reelected president, he's looking at this and saying, okay, we're going to have to step in here. Okay, so that's what we're talking about is American culture during this time as we lead up to World War II. The National War Labor Board. Before this, we had the Selective Service Act requiring men to begin the draft. We have the War Industries Board, which regulates all phases of industrial production and distribution in an attempt to coordinate everything. The National War Labor Board is the United States the government getting into the middle of labor management disputes so that at no time can a union say, we're going to go on strike. We're not going to work for the pay that we're being given right now. And even though the labor unions were big fans of the Democratic Party and they were huge fans of progressivism, they, were now found to be basically stopped by the Progressive and Democratic Party and told that they cannot strike at this time because it would hurt the war effort. So together we win. This is one of the slogans, get behind your labor management committee. And so the National Labor Board was really a court of arbitration to keep strikes from happening and settling labor disputes. The Food Administration, it was led by Herbert Hoover, who's going to become a big name really soon. This encouraged American people to produce more crops and conserve food by observing special days. Okay, now for that producing more crops, it was to get people who maybe even live in cities or in suburbs to start more gardening, grow vegetables out on a balcony or in a terrace or in an empty lot. It was all about starting to provide more and more food for yourself so that the majority of food that was being grown could be sent to the troops overseas. So it was also to help with the issue of shortages, which we're going to see quite a lot of. So wheatless Mondays and meatless Tuesdays. I feel like he really missed this, like why not do meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays? Hello, we can have a little bit of, alliteration going on here. But yeah, these are some of the ideas. The wheatless Mondays were really our first foray into low carb meals. It was all about eating lots of vegetables and not so much bread, because the bread was one of the staple items that was being sent over to the military. Meat was the same issue. Growing up, I used to love to read Grace Livingston Hill books. She wrote romance novels from the 1920s, actually turn of the century up to the 30s. And she wrote quite a few books that were set within World War I. And it was really funny because she hits this a lot. And so I'm wondering if she really, really got sick of chicken. But back in the United States, the people were farming chickens, lots of chickens, because you can get your eggs, which would make a great meat protein substitute. I'm a lacto-vegetarian. I use eggs in place of meat all the time. So people grew chickens for the eggs and also for the meat, because after a chicken lays for a few years, it's no longer able to lay. Cockerels are male chickens that can't actually reproduce, so they're often used for meat as well. But the idea of using chickens all the time, because the beef was being sent over to the military. So the military was getting the steaks and the beef cuts. The people in the United States were eating primarily chicken. And then when the soldiers came home, they were sick of beef, just sick of it. And they came home and they were just so excited to have chicken. And everybody else in the family is like, we are so sick of chicken. You don't even know. So it was really one of the funnier moments of some of those books was like people being so excited about having chicken and everybody else looking at them like, yeah, shut up. Okay. One of the posters for Food Administration is reproduced here. It says food, number one, buy it with thought. Are you really going to eat it? Are you going to eat it before it goes bad? Cook it with care. The idea of saving the pot liquor from when you cook vegetables, and that can be used later as soup stock. And some of you have grandparents or great grandparents who still do that. They'll boil vegetables and then they'll save that what's the water that's boiled off the vegetables. That's called pot liquor. Okay, it's not alcoholic. It's just what it's called. And then that was often used for soup stock the next day. Use less wheat and meat. This is all about making sure that the military gets that meat and wheat instead. Buy local foods because when you buy locally, you don't have to pay for as much transportation. Serve just enough. Everybody gets a single serving of everything instead of piles and piles of food. And then use what is left, using leftovers, which, most people didn't have to be told this. This was something that people have been doing for a very long time, is just serving enough and then using what is left over. Okay, the Committee of Public Information. This is an organization that is really about propaganda. It's about building up the United States in the eyes of the people of the United States to make sure that they're on the side of the U.S. when it comes to things like eating less meat and eating less wheat. Being told, hey, this is what your sacrifice is helping out overseas. So the Committee for Public Information, a government organization, carefully planned a campaign to keep morale high in the United States. The Espionage Act provided stiff penalties for anyone who furnished information which would aid the enemy, obstruct recruiting of soldiers. So if you got together with some friends and went down to a local draft board and said, hey, everybody burn your draft cards or get out of here, don't sign up for the draft or everything, that could be considered part of this Espionage Act. You could get arrested for that. That's obstructing recruiting. Or encourage insubordination in the armed forces, could be imprisoned because of that. Eugene Debs, who spent a lot of his adult life in and out of prison because he was trying to make some stands, he was an influential socialist leader. He was arrested under this act because he opposed U.S. entry into World War I. He specifically hated the idea that the unions be working with the government. He was constantly breaking laws when it came to unions and strikes. He wanted to be in the papers as much as possible and make himself kind of a victim that people would look at and say, oh, what is this guy trying to say? And then he'd get his message across. But he was primarily socialist. He was really wanting to actually run for president as a communist. So he was a guy he actually ran for president on the Communist Party ticket from jail. He didn't win, obviously. Okay, General John J. Blackjack Pershing. He was appointed by President Wilson to be commander of the American troops in France. That was the American Expeditionary Force, or the AEF. Now, he had a strong background in the United States military. He is the guy who chased Pancho Villa. He wasn't able to catch him, but he did prove his worth there. And so he's going to be sent into France to command the American troops. Now, you have to remember, this is a time of trench warfare, but they used some serious trenches in World War I. It wasn't the usual trench warfare where it was just dig a hole and stick your head out and shoot a gun. These were interconnecting trenches that actually had bunks inside the earthen walls. There were like little caves carved out. And for the most part, they were just horrendous fighting conditions because they were so far below the surface that water would seep up from underneath. It would also trap them when there's rain, a lot of rain. There was also no sanitation. So a lot of men got really sick in trench warfare during World War I, and people would get pinned down and they wouldn't be able to move for sometimes weeks at a time, wouldn't be able to get in and out of those trenches. They were overrun with rats and mice. It was just a horrendous mess. So now that we have American soldiers going over to Europe for World War I, they're going to be really pushing these new, fresh soldiers to finish the war very quickly. We're also going to see more soldiers taking to the air. Aces were pilots who downed at least 5 enemy craft, and by the end of the war, the United States had 22 aces, the most famous of which was Eddie Rickenbacker. He destroyed over 20 enemy planes and several balloons, but he had nothing on the Germans' flying ace, the Red Baron, who was, I believe, in the triple digits. The Red Baron was a famous World War II flying ace. If you like Peanuts, not the food, the comic strip with Snoopy, remember him? Snoopy's one of his fantasy is as a World War I flying ace, and he's always fighting against the Red Baron. That's when he makes his doghouse fly in his fantasy. So that should make sense now. What doesn't make sense is why we named a frozen pizza the Red Baron when it was the person we were opposing during World War I. I still don't know. I don't get that. Okay. While the United States is preparing to go over to Europe to join the European forces, the Allied forces specifically in the First World War, Russia was falling apart. Russia had sent millions of men into World War I, but they still lived with a feudal system, which meant that people who were in charge of land were the ones who were actually leading the country, even if they didn't have any natural talent. They were born into their positions rather than working into their positions. So what ended up happening is you had the officers of the military were actually landed noblemen who had no real work experience at all and definitely didn't have full military experience. Now, these men were being told to take troops and lead them into battle. What ended up happening a lot of times was these very untrained noblemen started looking at this as an opportunity to make some money to send back to their estates. And so they took the goods that were being sent to give to their troops, and they gave some of them to their troops, and they sold the rest on the black market. The troops saw this, and they began to exploit the black market as well. That means you're selling your equipment. So reality is that the lowest of the troops, the most needful of the troops, were not getting the materials that they needed. They weren't getting the proper shoes, weapons, coats, food. They weren't getting anything, and they ended up just looting the countryside, just trying to survive. So they were sent out to war, told to go to war, would be punished if they left the war, but yet were not given the supplies that they needed to fight the war. And so as a result, Russia lost 1 million soldiers. 1 million. That is crazy. In our bloodiest war, in the Civil War, we lost more Americans in that war than any other war. We lost over 500,000 people. The Russians in World War I lost 1 million. And it was all because they didn't have the equipment that they needed. The peasants knew what was going on. They got angry about what was going on because they were being used really to stop bullets for the soldiers, for the officers. And it got angrier and angrier, and the people in the cities were starving because all their food had to go to the soldiers, and then the soldiers weren't even receiving it. It was being given to somebody else for money. So in November of 1917, the Bolsheviks, a group of radical communists led by Vladimir Lenin, came to power in Russia. Lenin signed immediately an armistice with Germany. An armistice is a ceasefire, and withdrew his troops from the fighting. And that was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and it made peace between Russia and Germany. So what ended up happening is people got so angry at the Tsar and the other noblemen that they protested against the Tsar, and eventually they forced the Tsar from power. He and his family were sent to a palace that was outside of the capital, and they were kept there for a period of time while the government tried to stabilize itself, and that was an interim government. that interim government, as it's trying to stabilize everything and fight a war and fight this, this new threat of communism, they were getting frustrated. And the communists, on the other hand, were saying, look, they promised you food. Have you gotten any food yet? No, these guys have been in power for 2 weeks. You still haven't gotten a payday. Come on, we got to do something right now. And so that interim government was overthrown and the communists took over. Okay. I don't know why we're bouncing back and forth, but we are. That's just life. Okay, so while all that's going on in Russia, Alvin York, who was an American, he's considered the greatest hero of World War I. He was a mountain boy from Tennessee and a brand new Christian, and he wasn't really sure if he should fight in World War I, but he joined World War I out of sense of duty to his country and came to understand the difference between murder and, fighting for your country's life. So he joined out of a sense of duty to his country. But turns out this guy was a sharpshooter galore. He could shoot the eye out of a squirrel at, 50 paces. He was a good old boy country hunter who shot meat for his food. I mean, he shot to feed his family. And so as a result of his incredible abilities in shooting, he ended up killing more than 20 Germans. He captured 132 more. He was only a corporal at the time that his biggest time happened. He and his group were being led by officers, and every officer in the group died. And he was the highest ranking person as a corporal. So he gathered all the men together and he led them. And while he was still just a corporal, that's just one above private, that's when he captured 132 Germans, including German officers. And he compelled the German officers and the troops to carry stuff for the Americans. And he marched them back to the base and said, here, I captured all these guys. And they said, what in the world? Okay, but yeah, that was him. That was Alvin York. He did get a promotion. He was made sergeant. Okay, Wilson. President Wilson had this idea that he wanted to tell everybody the best way to run the world. He was socialistic in many of his tendencies, and it showed in the way he ran the country. He was a progressive, just like FDR had been. Nope, wrong one. Theodore Roosevelt had been, but Theodore Roosevelt still believed in big business and Wilson did not. So Wilson was bringing a little bit of this new socialist ideas into the world. And he believed that if people just followed his instructions, they would have world peace. Just do what he says, let him lead, and you'll have world peace. That is not how world peace happens. You have to have everybody kind of working together. But what he ended up doing is in his 14-point program, in 1 through 5, he proposed new programs of international relations. So ways that leaders of different countries could get together and talk about things and establish good friendships. Now, here's the thing, though. We had that before World War I. We had that, and that's why everybody split off almost immediately and started fighting each other. Because remember, the Germans were on the side of the Austrian-Hungarians, and the Russians were on the side of the Serbians. Those were allies. That had already existed, but he's saying, oh, we got to do it again. We can do it better this time. Next, he wanted to deal with the political and territorial future of Russia and Eastern Europe. 6 through 13 is somebody from outside of a person's nation saying, this is how you should do things. So this isn't going to be taken as very, people aren't going to want to be told what to do in their own country. It's just not going to happen. But his programs here, he demanded that if people hear him, listen to me and do this, and we will have world peace. And then finally, his 14th point was a general association of nations called the League of Nations, where everybody would get together, everybody'd send a representative, and issues would be talked out before war could take place. So it was to prevent war. Now, the armistice terms, when the United States and England and France all got together and they started talking about Germany is getting ready to surrender. What are going to be the terms of the surrender? So here are the armistice terms. Germany was to to evacuate all of the occupied territory and withdraw all her troops from west of the Rhine. So everything that Germany had gained in land, they had to give it back. They had to evacuate. A strip of land about 6 miles wide on the east bank of the Rhine River was to be a neutral zone. It wouldn't belong to anybody. Allied troops were to be allowed to occupy German territory. That's going to make people a little uncomfortable. Why should we have enemy troops in our territory as a result of our surrender? That's how they're going to look at that. Germany was to surrender nearly all of its warships and military supplies, so they had to give up their basis for defense here. Germany was to renounce the treaties that she had forced upon Russia and Romania. So these treaties that, we won't invade you if you do this for us, they had to renounce those treaties. Germany was forced to return all Allied prisoners. This is a common thing in treaties where prisoners of war are returned back to their homelands. Now, the people of Germany, the people who were being a part of that surrender, had read Wilson's 14 points, and they agreed with them. And they thought that that's what it was really going to be about. When they surrendered, they were going to be surrendering based on those 14 points. When on November 11th, 1918, Allied and German representatives met in a railroad car to sign an armistice, that means the ceasefire, it turns out that wasn't really what they were. It wasn't about the 14 points of peace. This is just the ceasefire. This just says, okay, we're going to stop the war now, and then we're going to come up with a peace treaty for everybody. So they were forced to sign that armistice, sign that ceasefire. Now, every year we still celebrate this. For about 20 years, it was known as Armistice Day, which is what an armistice is, a ceasefire. And then after World War II happened, instead of calling it Armistice Day, we started calling it Veterans Day, which is when we honor those who are in military service or who have ever been in military service. It's not quite the same as Memorial Day. Memorial Day celebrates those who are dead, who have died and have served their country in the past. Veterans Day celebrates those who are still alive. Okay, the Big Four. This is President Wilson, and he is all the way on the right of your screen. He's the tallest of the gentlemen. And then Prime Minister David Lloyd George, Georges Clemenceau, and Vittorio Orlando met at Versailles, the huge palace 14 miles outside of Paris, for a conference that was supposed to achieve a peace between equals. So this is where they're going to hammer out the final peace treaty between the Allies and Germany. However, there was no representative for the Central Powers at all in attendance. So Germany wasn't even at this conference where the peace treaty for them was being hammered out. It was only these men who were creating this. The League of Nations. Turns out that all of the 14 points that Wilson had written were rejected by the other three of the Big Four and all the other representatives of the Allied nations. But they did choose his 14th point. They said, we will do number 14. Now, at this point, Germany's really mad because they're like, the other 13 points were supposed to help protect us, and now you're saying you're not going to do it. Well, the other Allied people didn't want somebody from another country telling them what to do. Germany looked at it as, this is a way of protecting us. The other Allied nations said, this is the United States controlling us. But they did all agree on the League of Nations. This is an organization whose whole goal was to maintain future world peace. The idea that if there is an issue, instead of going to war, representatives can get together and talk it out. Okay. When the Treaty of Versailles was officially ending the Great War, the provisions in that treaty were ridiculous, to the point where Germany immediately regretted even stopping the war. They were losing. They were compelled to surrender. But the Treaty of Versailles infuriated them for a lot of really good reasons. The Treaty of Versailles was really all about punishing Germany. France, Italy, and England were all mad at Germany. They were furious at Germany, and they wanted to punish them as harshly as they possibly could. Wilson did not. I will give him credit for that, but he was one man of the big four. There are three other men there, and he was not European. The other three were. Okay, so the Treaty of Versailles that officially ended the Great War had some important provisions, including German territorial losses. That means they lost property that was their own. They also lost their colonies. So any colonies that they had outside of Germany were now being given to one of the Allied nations, which is going to really rankle the people of Germany, because they're going to see that as, okay, so we lost the war, now you're taking our property. The demilitarization of Germany. So their military had to be down to the bare bones basic, just enough to secure their borders. That was pretty much it. So they were demilitarized, meaning that all their weaponry, all their soldiers were disbanded. Then there was this one, and this is the one that's really going to make everybody furious. They had to pay reparations, which means they had to pay for all of the war damage that had been done during World War I. And Germany had to admit that they were guilty of starting World War I, even though they hadn't. This was started. Remember how all of this started? One assassin, a Serbian teenager, shooting two people in a carriage. That's what started World War I. But Germany is now being forced to admit that they started it, and they are not going to be happy about this. However, they lost. They have to sign this treaty. Okay. So when we talk about the Treaty of Versailles, here we go. This gives you a little more detail here. Germany was to blame for starting the war, and they had to admit that. Their army was reduced to 100,000 men. Their navy was only allowed to have 6 battleships. Again, that's all about protecting their coasts. They were not allowed any tanks, airplanes, or submarines. They had to pay $6.6 billion in reparations. They had to pay for the damage. Their colonies that were in other countries were given away. Germany was forbidden to unite with Austria, even though the people of Austria were of German stock. They had to demilitarize the Rhineland, which is that borderland. They had the Alsace-Lorraine, the borderland between them and Germany and France, had to go back to France. And Poland was given a strip of land called the Polish Corridor, and that was to protect them from Germany's borders. Okay, Poland's actually going to get its independence at this time, and it's going to be pretty exciting. Okay, and that's it for today. We are like 1 minute and 35 seconds short, so that's awesome. I think that's right on time. Okay, we finished this chapter, I believe, so go ahead and work on your homework, and I will give you a little bit of time to, let's see, what else do you have to do? I think you have a test review at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and give you until Thursday to make sure your homework's done and then your test review. Actually, I'm not going to give you a due date on that. Here's what I want you to do. As soon as your test review and your homework is done, go ahead and turn it in to the office at the school. I would shoot for Friday, and I will do my best to make sure that there is a packet available for you on Friday at the school waiting for you. If you can't make it to the school on Friday, I will also have it available for downloading. I'll make that available for everybody through email. I'll just basically send it as an email to everybody. And if you want to pick it up already printed, you can go to the school. And if you just want to download it onto your computer and print it off at home, you can just do that. Okay. But I'm still working on the homeworks and everything for the rest of the book. But this book, the workbook, is pretty much done. Don't forget that your test reviews count as a test, so make sure you do every little line, okay? And I will touch base with you again on Friday. Have a really good week.